I'm honestly not opposed to baseball year round. I'm opposed to playing baseball year round, but I'm not opposed to training for baseball year round, if that makes sense.
Hey, this is More Than Velocity. I am Bart Pear here with Ryan Croton and Jordan Oseguera, and today we are talking about pitching guidelines, pitch counts, regulating how many pitches these athletes throw depending on their age and activity level. There's a few different sources that have been put out. We have put out our own. ArmCare has their own pitch count regulations, which obviously we endorse and condone and feel like they're the ones that are going to be best for keeping your arm healthy and performing at the highest level throughout your entire career. Not focused on winning this game today as being the most important thing, but that your kid's career is the most important thing, and giving them the potential to go as far as possible. So that's kind of the overall. But Ryan Croton, I'm going to pass it off to you and explain. I want you to explain why we created our own pitch count guidelines.
Yeah, first I kind of want to point to what's going on scientifically, because people have been researching this. For people who are not aware, throwing arm injuries, particularly for the elbow, are at the highest point ever in the history of the game. So the scary thing is that in players ages 15 to 19, they are showing that they're most susceptible. So when you think about that age range, we have to consider what's going on before it, and account for accountability. There was a study that was put out that 92% of coaches actually don't follow the pitch count guidelines that were put out by Smart Pitch, and that's kind of frightening, to be honest, because the coaches are really the ones responsible for managing workloads, and when they're not following these guidelines, it's exposing athletes to risk, and this risk gets compounded each year. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot more adolescent injuries. And, people are just not aware of overuse issues. The amount of innings thrown per year, the amount of pitches thrown per year, their days rest. There's lots of different things. And as athletes throw harder, we need to be able to have better understanding of how to progress them and how to give them the right recovery in the schedule. And so, we've developed our own, based on a few different features, and, I can go through them. I'll let Jordan, speak a little bit on this as well, but, we can kind of give some of the foundations in terms of why we think the pitch count standards need adjusting.
Yeah, so, you say that number 92% of coaches aren't following the guidelines, and you look at it and go, well, that's a lot, but when you say it, it's not shocking. It's like no one's surprised at it. I've coached, in high school, I've coached in college, I've coached in professional baseball, I've coached in the private industry, and I have talked to coaches of all age ranges. And before they had, more detailed tracking aspects, even at the high school level, they're still not tracking pitch to pitch. But in pro ball, they used to call it pencil whipping the chart, where they'd go in with a pencil, they'd change the chart. So now instead of that pitcher going, 89 pitches, he only went 77 pitches. And they'd go through, I tweak a count here, I change this one here, so now they can pitch that guy a little longer. And the same thing would happen in high school baseball when they're not keeping track of these. And I mean, me and Ryan have been in the draft room together to find pitch information on a college player. Good luck. We have guys, at major Division I's in the SEC, the Pac-12. You can't find game log data for how many pitches they threw on a regular basis. And then you get into high school and you have one or two guys on the team that are throwing strikes, and whoever the home team is in charge of submitting those pitch counts for the rest of the week so they know who's able to throw what. They might fudge a little bit on the end of saying, well, this guy only threw 72 pitches. He didn't get to that 75, so he can now bounce back, depending on that state's regulations. And on Saturday now, instead of having to wait till Monday to throw again. So it's not shocking to me that 92%, and it's a really high number. And I think the reason it's not shocking is just because I've had so many conversations with people over whatever it's been, 15 years now, as a coach to some extent, and you hear some strange stories when it comes to pitch counts.
I know. I mean, when you're talking about the professional model, that's one thing that I think is unbelievably bizarre to me, is that with a pro pitcher who is more, mature, skeletally, stronger athlete, we are very rigid, usually with taking pitch counts. I mean, they're charting pitches at least. And yet when our kids are in the most vulnerable state, when they're growing and the bodies are not coordinated and, they're exposed to all these different growth plate issues, people aren't paying attention to this stuff. They're just not. And I just find it, really interesting as a parallel between how careful coaches are and administrators, front offices are with pitch counts, and it's a big deal. Sometimes pitchers get sent down in a major league season because they don't want them to hit a certain pitch count. Like, it is incredibly strict, or they're approaching limits, and this isn't happening unanimously. So
like I said, we've created our own pitch count guidelines, and we're recording this about the time that they're cleaning up the PDFs that we're going to hand out. So once this is published, that should be out. I mean, there'll be links here, and I'll provide links. If you go onto the armcare.com website, you'll be able to find them. In the blog, you'll be able to find them, so you can see. But it's surprising to me that we know fatigue is the number one cause of injury, and yet we've got, pitchers who are constantly, the best guys are the ones who are being pushed to be throwing when they're fatigued. They're pushing it, and you're just risking so much. So we know that, it takes into account of our pitch count guidelines. But we also know that the start of the season is when a lot of injuries happen. And so one of the key things about our pitch count guidelines is that we have a ramp up phase during the first 3+ outings that take that into account, that looks at science and say this is where the issues are happening, and so our guidelines should reflect that. So I'm going to pull up as we're talking some of the guidelines, and this isn't the final PDF. I just have some of the notes of it, and I'm going to let you guys talk about it. But that's one of the things that I really like about these guidelines, and so I'm going to do that. And I want Ryan you to kind of talk about what is this ramping up early season part of the guidelines.
Sure. Awesome. Okay, so I'll begin. So the concept of ramping up, the current standards that are done by PitchSmart, they assume that the pitcher, as soon as they hit the first game, that they're game ready to throw at their maximum pitch counts. And in my experience in professional baseball and being around pitching coaches and watching them chart bullpens and take in velocities, the velocities in a bullpen session are usually between 4 and 6 miles per hour lower than the average velocities in games. And, as we know from science that velocity and loading on the elbow are paralleled. So that means if I increase my velocity by a mile an hour, it increases my load by a mile per hour. We're probably not exposing the throwing arm to game loads, by just doing bullpens. And especially if the off-season throwing program for a pitcher doesn't have simulated games, there's going to be a much lower conditioning effect for the beginning of the season. So what we need to do is we need to extend that progressive overloading at the beginning of the year, and so for each age group, starting at 10 years old, we start them out at 70%. We give them the lowest possible percentage that they can get through most of the game, and we give them a graded increase of 10% each week until in the first month they hit their maximum. And again, this takes us a little bit further towards the safe zone of the season, because we know March, April, May are really high injury risk months for pitchers. And so part of the reason I believe is that the throwing programming and the pitch counts are not graduated. So that pitcher may throw at 100%, especially our best pitchers. Those guys are going to be throwing most of the games. And coaches, I know in college, I was a college baseball coach. I mean, we rode our starting pitchers, our number ones, really hard. We needed that first win of a series, and those guys are going as deep as possible. So you might get that pitcher from the get-go. They're throwing at their 100% limit, and they're not ready. They just have not been progressed well enough in the off season. So that's why we have this graduated approach to our pitch counts.
Jordan, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, to give a little more context to it is, not every high school is going to be able to have a build-up to where their player on day one, start of the season, their number one starter is going to be able to be at 100% max. He might have just come from basketball season. He might have just got done with wrestling season or whatever other sport he's playing to where he hasn't had that appropriate ramp up. So it's important to understand not everyone's ready for 100% max on day one. Some universities, they get that opportunity, the way that I don't know if the rules have changed from when I was coaching at the NAIA level or not, but we were allowed just to pick X amount of weeks throughout the year. So we would take a 4-week early comeback in the sense, or 3 weeks, I don't remember, from the start of the season. So now we have 3 weeks and then 2 weeks. So we have 5 weeks before our first game starts, plus classes, to where we could acclimate. And we did that, 70%, 80%, 90%. And then all of a sudden on, week one, we have 2 weeks of in a sense, a deload to where now we can do some higher intensity inter squads, get these guys ready. And then we start game one, and now our guys ready to go start of the season. So we'd always work backwards using that same formula. And the big thing that changes when you get into pro ball is everyone builds these guys up all the way through spring training. They build them up all the way through extended for the short season group. But then all of a sudden you go from playing on field 17 next to Whataburger, and now you're playing in a stadium with a couple thousand people in it. You have scouts, you have radar guns, you have, people heckling you, trying to warm up in the bullpen, and, someone's it's crazy, especially when you get into the minor league setting, and it gets even crazier when you get into the big league setting, to where there's so much added stress, not just physically like Ryan was talking about, but the mental aspect. And then you get into a game, and now you have to worry about, bunt plays, first and thirds, balls in play, where are you supposed to go? You have, controlling the running game, and everything else that comes along with that, who's up on deck. And you're handling all these things, that there's an added load from the not just the physiological, but the mental side of it. And that factors into these pitch counts as well, that no one ever takes that into consideration. Day one, there's very few guys. There's not a lot of Max Scherzers in the world that are ready to go a max pitch count day one of the season.
That makes perfect sense. So that's something you will definitely jump out at you when you check out our guidelines. The other thing you're going to notice is that our ages start at the age 10, and there's a lot of guidelines out there that start at as low as age 7 or even lower. We have a reason that we did that. What I'll let you explain, Ryan. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, kids need to learn how to be repeatable. And usually what happens when we work with young kids is we teach them one pitch. So they don't have a lot of variability, and they're throwing fastballs. They're trying to throw as fast as possible, which is, the nature of the sport. But they're not really mechanically efficient. And what can happen is that not only is it bad for the pitcher's development, but it's also bad for the hitter's development, because they're not getting strikes. You got a 7-year-old that's throwing the ball all over the place. The batter doesn't really learn very much about the strike zone. They're not getting a lot of pitches to attack and make contact. The defense doesn't get a lot of opportunities to work on their skills. It really brings down the quality of baseball at a young age for their development. And I think we lose a lot of young players because of this, because they get bored. I was I went from soccer and basketball to baseball, and my parents didn't put me into baseball until I was 9 years old. My first time ever playing baseball, I was about 9 years old. I missed the T-ball and all those levels that would have made the game really slow, and I might not have been so passionate about it. And so we need to have time too to coach pitchers. There needs to we need to actually have solid coaching programs from when they're a young age, that they don't have the pressure of throwing to batters, and that they can work on just finding the glove, and being consistent. Do they have the right movement mechanics that are basic to throw? And again, they're very young bodies, and they're very moldable. And so what we don't know is, with chronic throwing, chronic pitching, what it might do to the joints later on. Nobody's really done that research, other than there was one study in 1965 that looked at 9 to 14-year-old kids, and they found that every single elbow of a pitcher had some type of asymptomatic maladaptation. There were problems with it. And so if we can teach them the right mechanics, we can manage them early and wait until they're 10 years old to compete, they may be healthier in the future. We might have a greater participation in the sport of baseball.
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback on that, this is discussions me and Ryan have been having for probably 5 years, maybe longer now, that baseball almost has it flipped on the models of development, to where we play more than we practice at the ages that we should be practicing more than we play. And everyone wants to run this model of, year-round baseball. I'm honestly not opposed to baseball year-round. I'm opposed to playing baseball year-round, but I'm not opposed to training for baseball year-round, if that makes sense. Because you can really limit, stresses. You can make sure you're working on things to stay repeatable, to get more consistent with what those tools are. Whatever your skill set is, those are things that need to be focused on. I'm not saying a 7-year-old should be pitching, 9 months of the year. I don't think a 7-year-old should be pitching competitively. And one of the things that shocks me is, I've looked at some of these pitch counts that are out there. There's organizations that have looser restrictions on a 17-year-old than a major league team puts on an 18-year-old. There's zero back-to-back pitching for players a lot of times until they get to the big leagues. I've seen some pitch counts that say a 7-year-old can pitch back-to-back days if he doesn't throw X amount of pitches. That's insane to me. My kid's not 7 yet, but I've seen the way that his body changes on a weekly basis. 7-year-olds are growing even quicker at that point. They're different every day, and I personally just don't understand why. Not necessarily why, but how do these groups get away with having looser restrictions for a 7-year-old than a rookie ball coach has for an 18-year-old?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so just to be clear, ArmCare.com saying that player pitch should start at 10 and above, and if you're between the ages of 10 and 18, you should not be pitching on back-to-back outings. Those are some key differentiators between what else is out there, for sure. What are some other things that people might be surprised at looking at our ArmCare, our pitch guidelines?
I think one thing that will stand out to them is that the maximum daily limits for 13-year-olds is a lot lower than what is currently out there with the current guidelines. Our daily max when the 13-year-old division builds up to it is 70 pitches opposed to 95, I believe, with the pitch count standards that are out there. And the reason being is that between the ages of 12 and 15, we have our highest spike in the growth rate. It's called peak height velocity. It's where, especially in males in that particular age range, we have this accelerated growth. So if you think about, a bridge and two pieces of land. Your bridge is your soft tissue, your tendons, your ligaments, your muscles, and the two pieces of the land are your bones. Imagine the pieces of land shifting away from each other at a very fast rate. So those bones are growing. And what happens to the bridge, which is that soft tissue, it gets stretched, and it's going under these like high rates of plasticity. And these athletes, they're also on a bigger field. They're throwing harder, they're growing at a fast rate, so tissues are getting stretched out and elongated. and now they're on a big field, and we need to be able to be a little more patient, a little bit more conservative with this age group, because this is where I think we're seeing this huge spike in injuries between the ages of 15 and 19 is from this pre-adolescent age group. They're growing a lot, and then all of a sudden, we're putting a lot of stress on them. That's in addition to just the competition alone.
So let me play devil's advocate here. I'm the coach, or I'm running a showcase or something, and we've got teams that are coming, and they're going to be playing a lot of games in a very quick amount of time. How does this fit in? How do we make this work?
Yeah, so that's great. One thing that I think needs to happen, and I think it's great for baseball, is that teams need to carry a larger roster of pitchers, and they probably need to, if we don't have our pitch count start until 10, we can develop every player as a pitcher. They can all learn how to pitch. And the whole key is that now you got this workload sharing model where you have a lot of arms that can handle the loads, and not one arm gets taxed more than another. And I think that's the biggest problem, is that these rosters are very small when it comes to these, tournaments that are really high density. Some of these teams are playing 5 games in a weekend, and they got 3 pitchers or 4 pitchers that they can count on. Like that violates every element of pitch count standards. So, that's one thing that I can say to coaches out there, develop everyone to be a pitcher, allow them to have those skills, and maximize your roster size, especially going into these tournaments.
Jordan, what's your take on that?
I mean, I agree 100%. I still work with, I want to say maybe 6 kids that are in that high school age range right now, 6 or 7, somewhere in there. They're all in the travel ball season, and yeah, a lot of times they're like, yeah, there's 11 guys on my team, and he goes, my coach wants me to not start because now he'll be able to bring me back on Sunday. I said, no. Number one, I think that's a terrible decision. And it's like, I need to make sure that I'm at least being a voice of reason for this player. Because it's not that kids are uncoachable. It's that kids are almost too trusting sometimes, is what I've noticed. Is they're too apt to say, yes, sir, I'll do that, because a lot of parents are doing a pretty decent job with their kids, They're teaching kids to be obedient and listen and to do what's asked of them by authority. But just because someone is an authority figure doesn't mean that they have the best information at hand. So one of the instances that I told one of my guys that I work with is he has a good base of shoulder strength for a 16-year-old. So I said, you know what? We're going to go with it. I will let you pitch. You get 45 to 55 pitches on Friday. You're not allowed to pitch again until Sunday, and you only get a pitch if you're fully recovered. So he tested before his outing on Friday, did a full ArmCare eval. We got his range of motion. We got his strength, all 3 that we're testing. And then on Sunday it rolls around. He was still down in strength. And I said, well, tell your coach you don't get a pitch. And if he says you're pitching, just don't go. Like, he can't put you in if you're not there, number one. And number two, like, these leagues they play in, I'm not going to say the name of the league, but I said, ask your coach who won the last tournament. Coach didn't know. And it's because no one cares at the end of the day. I remember who won the last World Series. People remember that. But you're out in Arizona, Ryan. Who won the 6A state tournament this year in Arizona?
No idea.
Exactly.
I have no idea.
And you're heavily involved in baseball. Nobody knows because no one really cares at the end of the day. And I'm not throwing any type of baseball underneath the bus or anything like that. But even Division II baseball, who won the Division II World Series this year? I don't know. Do you think the scouts know? All they know is who's healthy, who's getting better, and who am I going to write my report on? And that's what matters at the end of the day. And I've recruited in high school. I didn't go to the schools that were winning state. I went to the school that had the better player. You could be, at middle of nowhere, town of 35 people, and you could be the best pitcher of the state. That's what matters, is that you're handling your development in a way that's going to be best for you long term. Because those travel teams are a fantastic place to get reps. They're a fantastic place to understand if you need to adjust your practice mentalities, but they're not the be all end all of whether you're going to get your scholarship or not. I don't mean to go on a rant with that, but that's for me with pitch counts is people need to really keep the long-term picture in mind and realize that the short term and the long term, no one really knows what happened at those levels.
So we introduced one other thing in our guidelines. It's called wave loading, and this really applies to those pitchers who are the ones that the coaches are going to ride. They're the ones who are hitting their 100% of their max pitch counts, start after start after start, and we feel like they're the ones who need to look at, especially at the collegiate and higher level, they really need to look at this wave loading. Ryan, why don't you explain what that is?
Yeah. So we did a little bit of sports science back when I was with the Angels and I was with Jordan. We looked at pitch completion rates. So it's a little bit different than pitch count. So it's basically the amount of your pitch count that you satisfied. So, if I had 100 pitches and I actually threw 50 and I was taken out of the game, I had a 50% completion rate. And most of these pitchers were completing about 84% of the pitches that were prescribed. And they were still getting hurt. And so the games where pitchers were going to their 100%, we're only looking at a 16% jump, and the athletes were showing there was injury exposure there. So, what we've had to do is wave load. How do we give these athletes particular instances of recovery? And so what we have, down for the amateur side is that if a pitcher hits their 100%, so they complete all their pitches, the next game after we give them 80%. We don't even let them go beyond that. So that gives them a recovery window. Then the game after that, it's a step up. It's now 90%. So these jumps going down and up are very small. And then they can resume to 100%. But if we ride out a pitcher who is our top pitcher every single time they're throwing to their maximum, we are going to expose them to injury risk and fatigue and poor performance potentially. So we have to also find ways in which we get our athletes to throw. We don't want to take away instances of throwing, but we can provide them opportunities to recover and still give us a good competitive model through the wave loading. Now at the pro level, the wave loading is a lot tighter. So it's only a 10% up and down. So they hit 100% completion. The next one's at 90% completion. The game after would be 100%. So it kind of goes in this little wave. Now, the key take home is if at any point the pitcher achieves less than 50% of their completion, that means the next game it has to be down to 80%. So that's an important feature too. So if they can't finish half the pitches that they're prescribed, they get knocked out of a game early, they have a bad first inning, we don't want them jumping from 35 pitches to 110 pitches in the next game. That's a big jump in workload. So we're trying to have a reasonable approach of where to put that athlete if that instance happens, that they don't complete enough of their pitches.
So to me, that was the really interesting concept of this that was very new to me in this workload management, is that you can actually not work enough in certain situations, and so we have to reduce your workload because that jump is something that is almost, it increases your risk of injury going from such a low workload environment to such a high one so quickly. And so, like, essentially, if you're scheduled to pitch and you have a bad outing and you don't get to your 50%, especially at the collegiate and upper level, you should get those extra pitches in, or you're going to be doing 80% at the next outing. Essentially, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, we tried a few things. We kicked around a few ideas. It didn't go too far in pro ball, but I think there's some teams that do it, at least at the lower levels, that if the athlete doesn't make 65% of their pitch completion, and they complete it in their bullpen. Now, in order to do this with an amateur team, you have to carry a lot of catchers, backup catchers. And so that means if a pitcher comes out of an inning, he's got 70 pitches, or sorry, 100 pitches, and he comes out of an inning and he's only got 35, so he's only done 35%. Well, he should be throwing another 30 pitches in the bullpen to get to that 65% of 100, and doing that within maybe 2 innings, simulated innings in the bullpen, and that way it keeps the workload constant. It's just an amazing thing. I mean, I've done a few research articles that are published that show no relationship, at least at the pro level, to pitch counts. Between starters or relievers or days rest or innings. But what I do believe is the impactful feature are these jumps. How the athlete is moving from workload to workload, and what their shape looks like. If it's not a wave loaded pattern, is it a huge spike and then a big dip, and then a big spike again? There's something that's people are going to figure out in that pattern. That's going to be a solid model for health, and we're starting with ArmCare.com to believe in this process and to put some parameters around that.
Yeah, I definitely think the wave loading is something that is collegiate and pro level, because you need the catchers, and it's it takes a little work to really stay on top of that. I think at the lower level, if you're using the pitch count guidelines and you're testing your strength and range of motion on a consistent basis, and helping and using the app to watch for fatigue, that should be, if you're 15 years old, that you're doing what you should be doing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. To jump on some real world examples of that, I heard an interview with Pedro Martinez a couple years back. Obviously, Pedro is always known for being real durable, real healthy, and he attributes one of it to having a manager when he was with the Red Sox that actually took care of him and, in a sense, wave loaded his outings. He would come up, he'd be pitching, and he goes, "Man, we're dominating. I'm cruising. I'm on inning 6 right now. I'm only in like 80 pitches." And next thing you know, here comes the manager asking for the ball. He goes, "What are you doing?" It's like, "We're winning. It's 3-0 right now. I got a lead." They go, "Well, we trust the pen right here. We're going to go to the pen. They're going to hold it for you." He goes, "But I'm fine. I'm not even at 100 pitches." He goes, "Well, I'm going to take you out now because I need you to go 110 in October. I don't need you going 110 today. I need you going 110 in October." So he says if it wasn't for a manager that had some feel for, in a sense, wave loading before we called it wave loading, who knows if Pedro would have been as durable as he is. So that's very applicable. It's stuff that's been done, but not universally accepted through the game of baseball. Traditionally, correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan, you've obviously had a lot more look into the research than I have, but from a practical standpoint, most people view pitch counts of a tiered progression like steps. And then once you get to the top of the steps, you stay at the top of the steps. You don't ever go higher than the top of the steps, and you never go down from the steps. And it's almost counter from what regular weight training does, because regular weight training and buildups have, a 1 week, an adjustment, 1 week, an adjustment, week 4, hey, let's deload it, and then let's get to a new level. There's always this viewpoint of, it's going to have ups and downs, but we're going to continually, trudge onward. Even if we have to grind through some stuff, we're going to trudge onward. But pitch counts go 80 pitches, 90 pitches, 100, 100, 100,
Yeah.
100, 100, 100, and it just doesn't change.
Yep, exactly. And that's the reason for, that wave load paradigm. Even if the team doesn't have a catcher available to complete pitches, but you at least know, okay, if they hit that 100, we're going 80, 90, 100 for an amateur, 80, 90, 100, 80, 90, 100. Professional, 100, 90, 100. We have to give them some opportunity to recover. This is physiologic tissue. This isn't, PlayStation. We don't know, what's going on in their bodies. Now, with our app, we at least know their neurological condition, how strong they are. And now, an informed coach, an informed strength coach, clinician, pitching coach, and player, they can have conversations and be like, my strength is down by 8 pounds from my baseline test. there's something going on. Like this week, you have me, pitching. I'm up to 115 that I can have as a daily max. We start having a discussion like this might be a week we reduce them to 80%.
And on that, I'm not I'm not going after old school or new school baseball. I still believe the pendulum is going to have to shift into the middle at some point. But you have, coaches in both ends of it, on the old school and the new school, that, again, you bring up PlayStation. And they look at a guy, they go, well, he hasn't pitched in 6 days. Why can't he throw 120 today? I don't understand this. He should be ready to go. Well, did you have 4 a.m. weights with him? Plus, a class that went from, 6 until 10 at night? And did you have the same crappy nutrition that he had because you guys have been on the road for, 10 days straight and he's been eating McDonald's and Burger King? Or, maybe he tweaked an ankle walking down some stairs and he rolled. Like, you don't know because you probably didn't have that conversation. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying this is across the board, but I would say there's a large chunk of baseball from these discussions that I've had where, people think it is a video game. They think that, well, he should be good to go. It's like, it's like changing the oil in the car. It's good for another 5,000 miles. Not exactly how the human body works. Like even when you train consistently, Olympians, the Olympics are going on right now. At least I think they are. I don't keep up with that stuff. But, they're training. The only thing they do is pay attention to their recovery, and they have training days and they have competition days where they're just not at 100%. It's just not possible to roll out there and feel great all the time. And that's just something I think we need to account for, and it's something that, the new regulations that we're trying to get rolled out and get a little more publicity to, I guess, in the sense, account for those things.
And I think that, one point that I think we got to drive home in all of this, they have to have like great communication with their pitchers. None of the pitchers that they should have on their staff should be throwing through pain. And it's usually not one throw that does it, right? This is an overuse condition. And we have to be on the lookout for soreness that's unusual. Like if the throwing arm pain and soreness doesn't go down in 48 hours of rest, that we should be seeking some kind of medical attention. We shouldn't wait and say, oh, we'll try it out. And all of a sudden, okay, it doesn't hurt at the beginning when I'm throwing. And then all of a sudden, this athlete that's had a forearm flexor strain that's been undiagnosed, he loses the strength in his forearm and he increases the load on his elbow and his ligament snaps. So there's certain rules like that have to apply, even though we have pitch count standards and the new ones we're putting together, we're really excited about. The communication, that's kind of what I'm getting at with what you're talking about, Jordan, is that coaches need to communicate, quite regularly with their pitchers, and if their pitchers are not feeling good, you better have backup plans, because if you're putting in an athlete who his arm doesn't feel great and he's hesitant and, you kind of, coaches influence him to get in that game, it's criminal. You're putting him, at risk of going under the knife.
Yeah, just to touch on that communication, it's pretty standard for most of baseball as well. The managers and the pitchers do not like each other when it comes down to it, because the pitcher is what's giving the manager the win or the loss, and that's going on his record for the rest of his life. And then obviously the manager is in charge of putting the pitcher in or not. He's the one writing the lineup card. So I know for me personally, maybe it's because I was awful, but I don't know that I ever made eye contact with a manager when I was actually playing. They usually just looked at me and they're like, I don't know why I still have you here, like, why can I not just get rid of you? But that's an important thing too, is, when I started coaching, is I made it a point that with my manager, I always knew who has X amount of rest, what is the communication they have. Even if this starter has not pitched since last week and we have a rain out, maybe he's on an extra day or two of rest, how does that starter feel? Because just because you have more rest doesn't mean you necessarily feel better. So I would always be in really good communication as a pitching coach with my staff. I need to know what those guys are doing because I'm responsible for them. As a pitching coach, you need to be that safety valve and that person the pitcher can trust to make sure you're going to have their best interest in mind. And you relay that information to the head coach, because the head coach has a lot of other stuff going on as well. Not only does he hate you because you just made him get a loss yesterday, but you got to make sure that he knows who's fresh and who's ready to go and ready to get into that game to make an informed decision. So for me, what I would always do, if there's any coaches listening right now, is I would always give my manager 3 usable options. If it's the 5th inning, we have our starter at 85 pitches. He's starting to get a little erratic. I'd say, hey, who do you want me to get moving around? I think we should go with A, B, or C. Who do you think? He goes, I like B. Okay, phone down, get B moving around. And then all of a sudden now, when that pitcher needs to go in, he's ready to go. So now your starter doesn't have to labor through those extra pitches because the bullpen wasn't ready. So again, like you're saying, communication is so important when it comes to not just managing your pitcher's health, but managing the flow of the game so you don't run into a situation where you don't have anyone loose, and now you got to rely on that starter who's fatigued to throw an extra 10 or 12 pitches to let your bullpen get ready. So communication, and more communication.
Yeah, I know
that's not the topic, but...
No, I mean, it's important. I mean, the other thing, we've been talking a lot about coaches. We've been talking about coaches and their impressions of pitch counts, but parents have to understand this stuff. I'm a father of 2 young boys, and I definitely want them to pitch. I want them to learn the skill. It's an important skill, and it increases their opportunity if they're a two-way player to be drafted and to be recruited in college. And I need to know these things, and I need to also play a part in the protection of my son's arms. And we've been speaking about this, and this is another thing. If the kids aren't really comfortable in communicating with the coach, the parents need to take it upon themselves to communicate, hey, my son's coming home after games and his arm is sore. We have to adjust something here with the pitch counts. And I've seen some informed parents walk over to coaches and tell them, hey, my son's at 40 right now. I just want to let you know he's at 40 pitches. Some coaches, they're not using a pitch clicker. They're not paying attention. They're not using those tools. So, the parents that are listening to this, you got to be in this as well. You got to be as informed as the coaches because that's what's going to do justice to this growing concern of injuries in adolescent, professional, and youth baseball.
Yeah, just to jump on that too, is the players need to be aware. I'm not asking the player to sit around with a pitch clicker and after every single throw, click it and put it in his back pocket, but he needs to be aware of these things because whether you're 16, 17, 15, you need to be accountable for your own career. At the end of the day, you need to take responsibility for your actions because you have a say in it. But then to kind of piggyback on what Ryan was saying with that as well, if your kid's not 18, you're still in charge of that human being when it comes down to it. And if you don't agree with the way it's being used, they're not an adult. So that coach, even if you signed a waiver, he's not paying the medical bill for when it comes down to it. I'm pretty sure it's your insurance that's going to be paying for it. So you need to make sure that if your kid is not 18 especially, that make sure the player's communicating with the coach. But as a parent, be involved in what's going on. It doesn't mean you're a helicopter parent. It doesn't mean you're a nagging from the stands. It means you're taking an interest in your son or daughter's development.
Yeah, I think that's where we should wrap up. But it's definitely hard as a parent, especially if you got you might say is an A player who's maybe getting invites to pitch in other showcases and things like that, and it's not just on one team, and maybe you can't make every game that they're out there, but you still need to be aware of how many pitches they're throwing, how much rest they've gotten, and follow something. I mean, it's that important. And so, I'd say go on our site, download these guidelines, track your kids' pitches, their outings, show them how to do it, make them understand how important it is. And this is what you do if you want to play at the next level. You treat it with respect, and that's how you get there. Awesome. Well, I think that's a wrap for today. Everybody, thanks for listening, and until next time.